Millionaire finds a small child on the street holding a baby and decides to take them home after discovering they were abandoned. The next day, the police showed up at his house. It was a cold night, one of those that seems to seep into your bones, even inside the comfort of the luxurious car that Richard Marlowe was driving. The city lights, usually bright and vibrant, appeared dimmed, reflecting Richard's somber mood. At 50 years old, he was a man who had reached what many would consider the pinnacle of success: wealth, power, and a grand mansion on the outskirts of the city. But despite all that, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had accompanied him for years. His life, entirely centered on his businesses, lacked something he couldn't quite define. That night, after an especially long day, he decided to take a different route home. It wasn't something he did often. Richard was a man of strict routines, someone who preferred control over surprises. Yet for some inexplicable reason, he turned right instead of going straight. The road he took led him to a part of the city he rarely visited, a dark and less traveled street where the opulence of his world had no place. The heat lights of his car illuminated a scene that made him brake sharply to the side of the sidewalk. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw a small figure huddled up. It was a child, barely visible through the faint light and the cold mist forming in the air next to him. Wrapped in a worn blanket was a baby. Richard froze for a moment, his eyes locked on the children, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a scene he expected to encounter on his way home, and for a moment, he didn't know how to react. The child, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, looked up when the car's headlights shone on him. There was something in his expression that made Richard feel a pang in his chest, a mix of fear and hope that seemed to pierce through the emotional armor he had built over the years. The boy said nothing, but his eyes spoke for him, showing a vulnerability Richard hadn't seen in a long time. Richard turned off the engine and hesitated for a moment. He wasn't used to getting involved in other people's problems, especially in something so far removed from his world of luxury and comfort. But that night was different. There was something about those children, a fragility and helplessness that resonated deep within him, touching a part of himself he thought had been lost. Finally making an impulsive decision that went against his nature, Richard got out of the car and approached them. Empty, cold was bidding G and the silence of the night almost oppressive. He crouched down in front of the boy, trying not to seem intimidating. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy looked at him but didn't answer. His eyes were filled with an understandable distrust, mixed with a weariness that didn't belong to someone his age. Richard, not knowing what else to say, extended his hand. "You can come with me. You don't have to stay out here in the cold." To his surprise, the boy accepted without resistance, slowly and cautiously. He stood up, holding the baby carefully, and took Richard's hand. The boy's skin was ice cold, and his tattered, dirty clothes offered little protection against the cold. Richard felt a lump in his throat as he led them to his car. He knew he was making a decision that would change something in his life, though he couldn't foresee how much. The drive back to the mansion was silent. The children, exhausted, didn't ask questions, and Richard didn't know what to say. His thoughts kept shifting, trying to understand why he had done what he did, but finding no clear answer. What was he doing? Why had he felt the need to help these children? Those questions tormented him, yet at the same time he felt a strange peace, as if he had done something he instinctively knew was right. When they arrived at the mansion, Richard was greeted by Mrs. Thompson, his housekeeper, an older woman who had worked for him for years and knew his reserved character well. The surprise on her face at seeing the children was evident, but her professionalism kept her from asking questions. She simply led them inside, where she prepared a hot bath and some food. Richard watched in silence, still processing what he had done. There was something about those children that disturbed him, something he couldn't fully comprehend, but that kept him alert and worried. After the children were settled in one of the guest rooms, Richard remained alone in the living room, lost in thought. The house, which had always been a refuge of silence and solitude, felt different that night. He couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to what he had seen on the street, to the boy's gaze, and the weight of the decision he had made. He knew this wasn't something temporary, that by bringing those children into his home, he had taken on a responsibility he couldn't simply ignore at that moment. For the first time in years, Richard felt that his life was about to change in an irrevocable way. The walls he had built around his heart were beginning to crack, and though he didn't fully understand it, yet he knew that those children had come into his life for a reason that time would reveal. And so as the mansion slept, Richard remained in the darkness of his living room, contemplating the beginning of what would become the most important journey of his life. Dawn slowly crept into the Marlowe mansion, painting the walls with a soft golden light. Richard, however, hadn't been able to sleep. He had spent the night in the living room, restless, with thoughts swirling that gave him no rest. His life, which until that moment had been so controlled, so predictable, now seemed to be thrown into emotional chaos that he didn't know how to handle. There was something about those children, something that awakened emotions in him that he had buried long ago. As he rose from the sofa and walked upstairs, the silence of the house felt overwhelming. He had decided to bring those children into his home, but he had no idea how to proceed from there. He, a man accustomed to solving complex problems in the business world, found himself lost in the simple task of caring for two small children. As he approached the door of the guest room, he heard a soft murmur, almost a whisper. He carefully opened the door and saw Tommy, the 6-year-old, sitting on the bed next to the baby. Although it was barely dawn, Tommy was already awake, looking at the baby with a tenderness and concern that moved Richard. It seemed that despite his young age, Tommy had assumed the role of protector, as if he understood that his little brother depended entirely on him. Richard stood in the doorway, watching silently. There was something in the way Tommy cared for the baby that seemed familiar, as if he were seeing a reflection of himself, though in a much younger and more innocent version. He remembered his own childhood, a time he had buried under layers of success and wealth, but that now seeing Tommy resurfaced with unexpected intensity. The sound of light footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Mrs. Thompson, always punctual and efficient, was approaching down the hallway, carrying a tray with breakfast. Seeing Richard at the door, her expression shifted to a mix of surprise and concern. She knew her boss well enough to realize that this wasn't something he had planned, and that the situation affected him more than he was willing to admit. "Good morning, Mr. Marlowe," she said softly, so as not to wake the baby, who had fallen asleep in Tommy's arms. "I've prepared some breakfast for the children. Would you like to come to the dining-in room?" Richard nodded, still looking at Tommy. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, although I'm not sure if the children are ready to leave the room." Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sir. Children are stronger than they seem. They just need a little time to adjust. If you allow me, I can help." Tommy carried the baby to the dining room. Richard stepped back, allowing Mrs. Thompson to enter the room. He watched as, with infinite patience and a natural gentleness, she helped Tommy get up from the bed and guided him toward the dining room, carefully holding the baby despite his usual emotional distance. Richard felt a pang of gratitude toward his housekeeper. He knew that without her, he would be completely lost in this situation. Breakfast passed in a strange but not uncomfortable silence. Tommy ate, quietly casting furtive glances at Richard, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. Richard, on his part, observed him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. There was something about the boy that intrigued him, something beyond the obvious vulnerability. Tommy was reserved, but his eyes spoke of a life experience that didn't match his age. After breakfast, Richard felt the need to do something, anything, to better understand the children now under his roof. He decided that the best way to start would be to talk to Tommy and try to learn more about his situation. However, when he approached the boy and asked about his family, about how he had ended up on that street the previous night, Tommy immediately shut down. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact, and merely shrugged. Richard didn't press further. He could see that the boy was battling something, and he wasn't ready to share the fear of not being able to help him. Gned at Richard, but he also understood that he couldn't force the situation. He would have to earn Tommy's trust, and that would require time and patience. Two things Richard wasn't accustomed to dealing with in his daily life. Throughout the day, Richard continued to observe Tommy, searching for signs, some clue that might give him an idea of how to act. The boy was surprisingly self-sufficient for his age, something that worried and amazed Richard in equal measure. Instead of playing or seeking attention, Tommy focused solely on caring for the baby. He changed the baby's diapers with a skill that clearly showed it wasn't his first time, and he fed the baby with the bottle Mrs. Thompson had prepared, without showing any signs of impatience or fatigue. That night, after ensuring the children were comfortable and well taken care of, Richard retreated to his study. The house was quiet, but his mind was far from calm. The unanswered questions piled up, and the feeling that there was something more, something he didn't fully understand yet, kept him on edge. He sat at his desk and opened a bottle of whiskey, his usual way of calming down after a difficult day. However, this time, the liquor didn't offer the comfort he expected. He stared at the glass, twirling it between his fingers, and suddenly, the thought of the children sleeping under his roof overwhelmed him with an unexpected force. What would he do with them? What role would they play in his life from now on? He knew he couldn't just let them go, not after what he had seen in their eyes. Finally, after a long night of reflection, Richard made a decision. He didn't know how or why, but he was determined to care for those children. There was something about them that made him feel responsible, something that awakened in him a protective instinct he didn't know he had. It would be difficult, he knew, but he also understood that this was something he had to do not just for the children, but also for himself. With that resolve, Richard went to bed knowing that although the road ahead would be challenging, he was ready to face it. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt he was doing something meaningful, something that truly mattered. As he drifted into sleep, the image of Tommy caring for the baby came to mind, and he knew this was just the beginning of a profound change in his life. The next morning began with an unusual stillness in the Marlowe mansion. Richard, who had slept little and poorly, woke up with a sense of unease he couldn't fully explain. As he descended the stairs, he was greeted by the aroma of the breakfast Mrs. Thompson had prepared, but the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, laden with an invisible tension. Tommy was sitting at the table, feeding the baby with the same skill he had shown the day before. Richard watched them for a moment from the dining room door. Feeling a mix of admiration and concern, he knew he needed to find a way to get to the bottom of the children's story, but he didn't want to pressure Tommy, not until he had earned more of his trust. However, the morning's silence was abruptly interrupted by a loud knock at the front door. Mrs. Thompson, who was serving breakfast, froze, her eyes meeting Richard's, reflecting the same surprise and concern. Richard felt a chill run down his spine as he walked toward the door. When he opened it, he found himself face to face with several police officers. Standing in front was a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a posture that radiated authority. Beside him, a young woman with sharp eyes observed him with curiosity. The man stepped forward and spoke in a firm voice. "Mr. Marlowe, I'm Detective John Harris, and this is my partner, Detective Sarah Carter. We're here because of a report received last night about the possible abduction of 2 children. We were informed that a man was seen taking a small child and a baby from a street in the city center. We need to ask you some questions."